and Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. It is 2020, and to date, 5,400 children have been separated from their parents along the southern border. It is 2020, and even though the US population only makes up about 5% of the world population, the US has nearly 25% of the world's prison population, with disproportionate numbers of black and brown prisoners. It is 2020, and we are on the brink of war with yet another Middle Eastern country, with our president threatening not only the lives of brown people, but also explicitly threatening their cultural heritage sites, labeling both the sites and the people expendable. It is January 2020, and the march is not over. We have work to do. And we are called by our faith to do this work. In an article entitled, "We Must Dismantle White Supremacy," on the UUA website, we are urged that white supremacy affects everyone. As Unitarian Universalists, we must fight white supremacy individually and together if we hold hope for beloved community. There is work to do in congregations, and there is personal work to do. These words are followed by a list of links and resources that can help us sharpen our eye towards white supremacy culture and institutions, others and our own. Systemic racism in employment, wealth disparities, infant mortality, housing, education, environmental health, incarceration, and healthcare access. The article also provides readers with resources to combat our own biases, as well as rich materials and ideas to help UU worship to become more culturally diverse. It is a great article, and I can highly recommend it. I'm going to make sure that I share the link on our Facebook page. And yet, I often feel that this personal work that we are urged to do must go deeper. It is true that we have to focus on the institutions, but institutions are made up of individuals. And sometimes we, as individuals, unintentionally uphold white supremacy culture, this insidious ideology that the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of people of color, simply because we don't examine it, we don't see it, because we are too deep in it. And that keeps us from doing the work effectively, because we keep undoing what we meant to do, just like Sisyphus, the Greek king, who every day would push a large rock up a steep hill only to find it rolling back on nearing the top. Just then in our case, the rock is within us. And it is not just white people who are affected by white supremacy culture, but people of color too. Because it is hard to live in a culture, be surrounded by a culture, without that culture starting to live in us too. Yet the effects on people of color are different and often more harmful. If we want to talk about white supremacy culture, we really need to talk about culture first. We often think of culture as food, dance, or music, art, and architecture, because these things are visible, tangible, and we ignore the intangible parts of culture. So then what exactly is culture? How can we make the invisible visible? Let me get academic for a second. One common definition states that culture can be seen as an integrated pattern of learned beliefs and behaviors that can be shared among groups and includes thoughts, styles of communicating, ways of interacting, views on roles and relationships, values, practices, and customs. So pretty much our whole life. An easier way to understand culture is a look at the cultural iceberg. On top, we have all these things that can be easily seen and observed, right? Music, food, festivals. But below the surface is what is often unseen. Social expectations, communication styles, relationships. And while in the upper part, the seen part, white supremacy also appears, calling some artifacts art and putting them into a museum, and others handicrafts, and expecting to pay low prices in souvenir shops is definitely a product of white supremacy. These things are easier to spot. All the parts on the bottom, that is where white supremacy culture is most firmly rooted, because we cannot spot it easily. And that is too where white supremacy culture does the most harm. Two authors who are often cited and used when we talk about white supremacy culture are Kenneth Jones and Temao Kuhn. They came up with a list of characteristics of white supremacy culture, as you can see there, as well as short descriptions of their antidotes. And that document is also one that I'd be happy to make available for you. I think that this list can be really helpful in some ways. It gives organizations and institutions a starting point to examine their own cultural blind spots and start changing their culture in a way that creates more cultural diversity and equity. But I don't think this list necessarily lends itself well for doing the deep self-examining cultural deep dive that we need if we want to actually dismantle our own holding on to white supremacy culture, or any unexamined cultural convictions for that matter. So what I would like to do is take one of the characteristics listed on the bottom part of the iceberg and use it as a model with you right here. An example of the work that is necessary and an examination of how deep cultural concepts go and how much they influence us. So today, let's go with notions of time or sense of urgency as it appears on Jones and Okune's list. Did you know that there are monochronic and polychronic people? And that these differing attitudes towards time are to large parts rooted in culture. Let's look at monochronic people first. Are you monochronic? Do you tend to do, or at least aim at doing, one thing at a time, trying your hardest to not let the world around you distract you because you commit to one task at hand? Unless, of course, multitasking would be more efficient in a given moment of time. I remember growing up, my mom was a teacher, and she would have a lot of grading to do. So every Sunday afternoon, she would go into her home office, close the door, and the rule was that you would not interrupt unless someone was hemorrhaging. And even then, you would not first. Deadlines are important, plans should be followed, privacy is not to be messed with, unless maybe someone is hemorrhaging. And abiding by all these things is a matter not just of efficiency, but also of reputation. You don't want to be known as the person who is late, because the person who is late is also the person who is lazy, unorganized, lacks attention to detail, and does not value the time, the limited, precious, carefully scheduled time of others. They're disrespectful. There's very little time in our lives, so we have to keep a careful budget. And unlike money, there are no credit cards where we can charge a big chunk when we need it to be paid back later. Does any of this sound familiar to you?
No, not at all.
Maybe your time management skills are really good, and this is a point of pride for you. Or maybe you're the person who's always running a little bit late, always feeling like the person who's unorganized, always a little bit defiant, a little bit embarrassed, a little bit resentful. If that latter person is you, then you might be a little bit more on the polychronic side. If you're polychronic, the whole idea that time is limited and therefore needs to be carefully managed and budgeted might feel a lot more counterintuitive. This constant sense of urgency is pointless. After all, time stretches into the past and into the future like the branches of a giant, never-ending tree. So instead of trying to hold on to time, you just need to let go and throw yourself into the swirl of it like a leaf dancing in the wind. Doing many things at the same time is just the way you groove. You deal with things as they come up, and you see them as what they are, things that come up rather than distractions. Deadlines are aspirational more than binding, as long as the product is of high quality. And tending to relationships is much more important than always being punctual or efficient. After all, we are here to connect more than to achieve. So even when time is of the essence, you still take the time to check in with the person in front of you, inquire about their well-being and how little Charlotte is doing in school, and did Sally finally get over that chronic bronchitis, and if not, you have a really great family remedy and you'd be happy to share it. In fact, you'll make it and drop it off later today, because building and maintaining relationships is even more of the essence. Hearing all of this might feel really validating to some. Or maybe you're having a minor panic attack right now. Not everyone wants to be a dancing leaf in the swirl of time. But regardless on where you fall on the spectrum, I hope you can see that there is virtue to both sides, and also that pushing any of these sides to the extreme might not be ideal. Now, I already said that our relationship with time is largely based on culture. North American and Northern and Central European people are said to have a more monochronic perception of time, at least in terms of large cultural patterns. More of a sense of urgency, whereas Mediterranean, South American, African, and Asian people are seen as polychronic cultures. Of course, this is a gross geographical simplification, and it ignores that this attitude towards time is a spectrum rather than two opposing points. But there is some truth to it. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, I traveled to Cairo, and I was talking to Reem, a young woman I met there. Reem was amazing. She was about my age, but she was a university professor. She had published 2 books, and she was an amazing person to talk to. I had been lucky enough to be put in touch with her by a mutual friend, and since we got along well, we wanted to meet again. So I started scheduling, taking out my calendar, my plans for my remaining days there, and she just stared at me. And it got us talking about how we approach and manage time. I told her how in the US, when you want to meet a friend, you take out your planners and you flip through them, and if you find a time next Tuesday at 3 when you're both free, you plan to meet at that exact time in a specific place. Most times it is assumed that this meeting will take about an hour. So if you and that person are really close, then maybe you'll plan on two. Sometimes you have different perceptions of how close you are, and that's problematic. As I was talking to Reem, she just laughed and laughed and laughed. You schedule an hour next Tuesday at 3. Really? As she was wiping the tears from her eyes, she says, how am I supposed to know in the morning if I feel like hanging out with you in the evening or next Tuesday, for that matter? We ended up agreeing to meet sometime in the late afternoon, 2 days later, somewhere near the university. I refrained from hammering out a specific time and place in advance. She promised she'd make sure she'd feel like seeing me. And 2 days later, sometime in the late afternoon, in a small coffee house near the university, a good time was had by all. So in Egypt, where the culture is much more polychronic, I looked a bit silly with my sense of urgency. I wonder how Reem, this amazing, successful, published woman, would fare in the US. So our relationship to time is in part rooted in culture. But culture is always in flux, ever changing, and no culture is a monolith. There's always interplay between dominant culture and subcultures. Cultural identity also does not imply homogeneity. Personality plays a big part. There will be some polychronic people in monochronic settings and vice versa. Rather, culture establishes a norm and influences how you are seen and how you see yourself in regards to this norm. So, in a deeply monochronic environment, being polychronic will probably count against you unless you force yourself to function more like a monochronic person. And it might make you feel bad about yourself and anxious about your environment. I, for example, grew up in a super monochronic setting. Germans start questioning the world, God, and everything if the bus is more than 2 minutes late. It doesn't mean they're fine with it being up to 2 minutes late. It's just they're not having an existential crisis quite yet. And yet, for German standards, I'm a pretty polychronic person. And I always felt so bad about that. I had so much shame about that. Until I actually learned about the fact that polychromy is a thing, and it's legitimate, and it has advantages, and that felt so deeply validating to me, so liberating. And ever since, I am leaning more fully into my polychronic self, and though I have yet to be punctual for a single board meeting, I'm sorry, Deborah, I do get my sermons done, and my papers written, and my child fed, and my classes taught, and all with minimal crying, self-loathing, and anxiety. Doing this work, examining how you are influenced by the culture that surrounds you, not just in terms of time, but also in terms of relationships, gender roles, communication styles, hierarchy, work habits, and so many other things, can actually be really liberating for yourself. There's something in it for you, personally. It offers us an alternative to the rules and standards we assumed were unalterable. But much more importantly, we need to do this work if we want to create King's beloved community that is rooted in justice, equal opportunity, and love for one's fellow human beings. Because if we force others, especially people from other cultures or people of color, into the norms of white culture, if we see white culture and its norms and rules as the only way that things are and that things should be, as supreme to other ways of being, there is no justice. And if we force others to function within cultural norms that are not their own, that feel strange and unnatural to them in order to be successful, then there is no equal opportunity. And if we impose value judgments on people that are based on our cultural norms, without taking into account the validity of their culture, there is no love for our fellow human beings. For example, if we turn one's relationship to time into a character judgment of that person, into a value judgment of their work and abilities, we fail to see that person in all their potential and humanity. And instead, as Galeano so pointedly said in his poem, we start seeing them as people who are not human beings, but human resources, who do not have faces, but arms, who do not have names, but numbers. We think of them not as those who appear in the history of the world, but in the police blotter of the local paper. And eventually, they become the nobodies who are not worth the bullet that kills them. This toxic theme snakes its way through human history. We see it in the colonialism of past centuries, where economic exploitation was excused by notions of white men's burden to civilize the people whose land, resources, and freedom was stolen. We see it in the slavery of the past and in the slavery of the present, in mass incarceration and detention camps and the border, in the unjust and dehumanizing conditions created all over the world by neo-imperialism. We also see it when white people call the police on people of color simply because they behave outside of the cultural norms white people see as universal rules of human behavior. White supremacy culture is alive and thriving. It is harmful and oppressive, and for many, it is deadly. We see all this and we feel powerless. But we are not powerless because culture grows from individuals. And if we dismantle white supremacy culture not by completely letting go of our own cultural norms, but by simply seeing them as that, cultural norms that are not more binding than the authority that we give them, and not worth more than the value that we bestow on them, then our approach to ourselves and to others can start rippling out into the world. It can influence our family, our community, our neighborhood, schools, workplaces, organizations, even our church. And we can liberate ourselves as we liberate each other. So take the deep dive. Start examining yourself as a creature of culture and habits so that you can better see the beauty, diversity, and humanity of all of those around you. It may feel passive, introspective, and not part of the work towards racial justice, but it is part of the work. It is how we can recalibrate ourselves on this long, ongoing march so that we don't run in circles. Do the work. Stay vigilant, not only about what is going on in the world around you, but also about what is going on in the world within you. And then, with clear eyes and open hearts, march on. May it be so, and blessed be.